Hello, this is Jason from Liberate Raleigh, and this is another Liberate Raleigh video. The topic of this video is going to be a continuation of the Voluntary City series, which I did a prior video on the introduction to, which is this book right here, Voluntary City. I covered the intro and just gave an overview of this particular book and what was in it. And in this video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover 4 of the chapters in this book, chapters 2, 3, 4, and 5, which cover private urban planning and development. I'm not going to go into a deep dive into these chapters because I'm going to be honest, this book has a phenomenal amount of detail and information. I highly recommend that you not just watch these videos, but you read, get this book and read it so you can see all the details and the material involved, because it's been very eye-opening to me. But I do want to give a introduction, sort of an overview of what I've been learning by reading these chapters. So I've read chapters 2, 3, 4, and 5, so I'm going to go through those right now. Chapter 2 has to do with urban planning and development in England from about 1750 to mid 1700s to mid 1800s. I think the dates that they covered are 1750 to 1840. And in this period of time in Britain, there was an explosion of population. There was also a shift towards urbanization, and the demographics were changing such that people were moving into the cities. This also had a lot to do with the Industrial Revolution, but there were also transportation was becoming better. Turnpikes were being built. There were canal companies that were making it easier for people to move and relocate to the big cities. So there was a great need for housing and all those services and structures involved with housing. But the issue here was there was no government planning at either the city or national level. That did not occur until the second half of the 19th century. So all of this had to be handled through private voluntary means. So what this chapter covers is how that was done. So what happened was all this was done privately, and critics will sometimes charge when reviewing the history here that the middle and upper class amenities and development was done well, but the lower class was not done well, and it was of low quality, or maybe they overproduced it. But basically that mid to upper class was, the development was done very well, but then the lower class was not. However, the issue here is when people make this statement, they're comparing the real world record to a perfect ideal. So it doesn't really follow that the private voluntary means failed. If you're using that sort of standard, you have to compare it to, you'd have to compare it to real world scenarios and like real world public housing, which has been pretty much disastrous, at least in the United States, but it's just not worked out very well. But anyway, the point is to get into how these things were handled via private means. Oh, and there's another criticism that people will make. They'll say that it wasn't done in a very orderly fashion. But the problem here is the definition of orderly is, it's not very meaningful in that they simply use orderly to mean top-down, top-down planning from the government, and anything that comes via organic, bottom-up, decentralized planning to mean that it's disorderly. So these criticisms don't really carry much weight when you really think about it. But I'll get into but the main purpose here is to get into the record of how these services and structures were provided, given that they were not being provided via publicly via the government, and they were not being managed through city or national planning via the government. So what would happen was there would be landlords that would speculate in purchasing land and either selling it or leasing it out. And they would lease it out to speculative developers who would then hire small builders to step in and actually build out the residencies. And also what they would do is they would build out infrastructure surrounding these residences, this housing, things like streets and pavements and that sort of stuff. But the issue that this pertains to is supposedly these sorts of structures would not have been produced given the public goods argument against against private provision of these things, because supposedly because a lot of people would benefit from the roads, there's no way to internalize the externalities of these sorts of things. So because everybody might benefit from a road, and theoretically there's no way to exclude people from it, there's no reason for anybody to actually step up and produce the road. However, in this case, what happened was there was not just in this case, but the issue that overcomes this is that by having these plots of land that these people were speculating in, these plots of land and the housing that was on it would be more valuable if they had things like streets and lights and structures of that nature. So there actually is an economic incentive to plan and build out these sorts of things. So, and this isn't unusual when you look at supposed free rider public goods problems that are supposedly intrinsic to certain private provision of certain things. It turns out if you look at the historical record, there were ways around it that people actually did and got around it. So in this sense, these things were provided, and this was the reason why they were provided, because people were speculating on the value of these plots of land, and they could sell them or rent them out at a better rate if they had these structures. So they were not subject to this supposed free rider problem or public goods problem as one would expect. Now, there were two ways that some of this was managed and organized, and those were private acts of parliament and private covenants. Now, a private act of parliament, this was sort of a minor thing. They weren't very common, but that was when Parliament would exempt certain private parties from a general law. So there would be, for example, there might be a law that everybody in the country is subject to, but Parliament could do a private act that would exempt certain people, and that would allow them, in this instance, to engage in certain types of development. But the other one that was the major way in which this was handled was through covenants, and these were private contracts that might arise between developer and landlord or the residents, such that stipulations might be made upon the development of the land, or maybe the structures involving the land, or perhaps even restrictions on how the people living there what people living there could do, as far as how they could live there, and maybe the sorts of things that they could do to the structures. So those were the two main ways that this was handled. So to give some examples of how covenants would actually stipulate what could and could not be done, and how they would manage development for this sort of housing. They might do things like, and they would be applicable to either sales or leases, depending on the circumstances involved. One stipulation of a covenant might restrict, put for example, a time limit on how long somebody could wait before development on a particular plot of land was developed. So if somebody wanted to engage in land speculation, there could be, by waiting out before developing on that plot of land and perhaps maybe reselling it later, there might be a restriction on that. Might also be restrictions on how the buildings could be used, so that annoyances such as loud noises, maybe some smells, even pollution, how could be prevented through the use of the covenants, where people agreed ahead of time that they would not engage in certain actions and they would not use the buildings in certain manners, such that they would produce loud noises or other annoyances. Another thing might be in more expensive neighborhoods, there would be restrictions on building materials, so only the highest quality materials could be used. That would be another reason why, that would be another thing that covenants could be used for. And finally, another main thing that covenants could be used to regulate would be the spaces between buildings. So maybe they would want to have sidewalks or lighting or streets or things of infrastructure, just general residential infrastructure that you might expect to see pretty much anywhere. Covenants could be used to manage and organize that, such that it was done to satisfy the needs of the people that were going to be living there, or things along that nature. And the other thing was that these covenants, obviously, because they were this development was being done on an open market, the covenants had to conform to the market demand that was being placed upon the people that were, like the landlords that were speculating in the land and the developers that were speculating in the development of these residential areas. So that kind of goes back to why people would say, oh no, this was very disorderly and there was no top-down planning. But the issue was because tastes can vary wildly based on the area or the people involved. It may appear that these things are disorderly, but the order comes from the response to the market demand and the market forces involved, such that if people are demanding something, then generally what will happen is that the market will conform to provide that supply. The other thing is that this overcomes the free rider problem by tying use of these structures to use of the land itself. And as I said earlier, the economic incentive would be that the land and the structures and the housing would be more valuable, such that you could get a better price or a better rental income if you provided these services voluntarily. So it was a win-win for everybody involved. Now, this was covenant development in England was the primary form of development up until the second half of the 19th century, when the government started encroaching upon, through regulation and taxation and spending, upon this sort of thing. But for a good century before the government started to step in and take this over, this was done privately, and it was done successfully. So again, as I said in the intro video, this is not an instance of there was a failure and these things weren't being provided. These were being provided privately. It was just the natural dynamics of the expansion of the government that stepped in and took it over. So here is one example in chapter 2 of the Voluntary City, where this free rider public goods problem was overcome, and supposedly public goods such as roads and so on and so forth were provided in the residential areas of England for about a century, from the mid 18th to mid 19th century. So moving along to the third chapter in the Voluntary City, they talk about, this chapter involves the private places of St. Louis, which arose in the mid-19th century, and these private places still exist to this day. And what this is a private place is, say, like a subdivision, a plot. Along a street there might be plots of land subdivided, and the management of those plots of lands would be handled by covenant restrictions, which was called an indenture, and these things would be written into the deed of ownership for these particular areas. So I guess it's sort of similar to the covenants that Britain had, but had some differences. But it's a similar strategy to internalize the supposed externalities that can't be overcome via private voluntary means. And one of the early innovations for this was at a place called Van Deventer Place. And what they did was, they would, in this particular private place, what they would do is they would have a group of trustees, and I think it was 3 trustees, that were people that would manage the improvements and the infrastructure involved with the private place. As I guess it would sort of be analogous to a homeowners association, and they would have to live. They would have to be residents of this area, and the other owners were sort of junior trustees, I guess you could say. But the main innovation was that there was an organizing group that would handle managing the day-to-day activities and perhaps even the long-term planning of the infrastructure and the management of the particular private place in question. St. Louis was not the only city in the United States that had these private places, but it was true that St. Louis had a much higher concentration of these private places than other cities. And the main reasons for that were that low levels of taxation, lower levels of spending, and in general corruption involved with whatever planning and spending the city was doing. So because of this, the private sector stepped up and started providing these things, because the city was not, and whatever it did was subject to exorbitant amounts of corruption. In fact, at the time, starting in the mid-19th century, the private places of St. Louis were actually advertised and sold as havens to get away from the corruption of the government. So here we have explicit government failure, and the free market of private voluntary provision of these services is explicitly being billed as a way to get away from this government failure. And again, by tying use of the land to the use of these infrastructures that were associated with the land and other activities, like for example, some areas would ban the burning of bituminous coal, which was very dirty and created a lot of pollution. So you could internalize these supposed externalities by tying the land to these actions or these infrastructures, and they were overcome through voluntary means. And things like pollution, again, could be stipulated as certain actions like like I said, the burning of coal could be banned through voluntary means of the indenture to prevent this sort of pollution from occurring within those private places. Another interesting aspect of these private places and the trustee organization involved was they created a form of representation for the people that lived in these areas. And there's an example in the book, and again, holding the book up, The Voluntary City, highly recommend that you read it. There's an example of a particular railroad company which was going to build a railway and some other structures near one or more, I can't remember if it was more than one, but it was at least one private place. And these sorts of, the railway and the structures were not going to be very well received by the residents of the people living there. So through the use of the trustees and that organizational structure, a subscription was raised by the residents. They paid certain amount of money to give to the trustees, and they were able to purchase other plots of lands and finance development on those plots of lands to act as a buffer zone between those areas and the areas that the railroad company was going to develop. And they were also able to go directly to the railroad company and negotiate with the railroad company such that the company would alter the type and form of development that they were going to do, which would be more amenable to the people that were living in the private place. So it was almost like a mini quote-unquote government in that sense. But the point is, it was a private voluntary form of representation that could act in the interests of the residents living in this private place and look out for their best interests and act on their behalf. The other thing was that these private places acted as, they would institute things similar to zoning restrictions, which were pretty much restrictions on the type of development and building that could be done within the particular private places. So I don't want to say zoning restrictions because that kind of implies, laws were passed, but that was not the case. The trustees who were assigned management duties could manage the sort of development that could be done within those plots of land in the private areas, and also this could be written into the indentures. So what this would do is there might be restrictions on, say, putting a manufacturing plant in the middle of a private place. So it's similar to zoning laws, but again, this was all handled through private voluntary means. And this was a very effective way of doing it, and this persisted well into the 20th century. But then again, as with England, what would happen is the government, through its natural inclination to expand, would start passing laws and engage in spending that would remove many of the economic incentives that pushed people to engage in these voluntary structures to begin with. Because another thing about the zoning restrictions is they were acted in economic self-interest, in that the restrictions would they were done to preserve the value of the plots of land for the residential owners. So the government would step in. Again, these private places persisted well into the 20th century as a primary source of development and management in the city of St. Louis. And then again, the government would begin to encroach through taxing and spending and passing laws and regulations which would prevent or inhibit the ability of people to handle these things privately. But they still persisted, and I believe in the 60s they made a bit of a resurgence, but these private places still exist to this day in St. Louis and act as a testament to the ability of these things to be handled outside of government influence by everyday ordinary people. So moving along in the book, The Voluntary City, to chapter 4, this handles some more private development of infrastructure, and in this instance it refers to the turnpike road companies of early America. So in the late 1700s to early 1800s, there was a big demand for the development of roads because the population of the country was increasing. However, public resources were unable to handle this. So if it was going to get done at all, it was going to have to get done through private voluntary means, which is exactly what happened. So these turnpike companies would raise money, and what they would do is they would build a road from city A to city B, and then they would take money via tolls at various points along the way. They would collect money, and that's how they would handle the maintenance of the road and pay any dividends to the people involved. So roads are generally brought up as a free rider problem as far as being a natural public good that needs to be handled by government. However, there was a lot of road development done privately in this time period because, like I said, public resources were dramatically insufficient to handle doing it. And there was also the added, historically speaking, these turnpike companies were not profitable at all. So you've got the double whammy here. On the one hand, you've got the public goods issues and free rider issues that supposedly would indicate that these things would never get built, or would get built to a level far less than what would be optimal. And then on the other hand, historically speaking, these things weren't even profitable to begin with. So the question then becomes, well, was it simply an instance of just a whole lot of investment and development all at once was done and people expected them to be profitable and they just happened to not be profitable? That actually was not the case. It turns out that people knew ahead of time, or either knew or pretty much or expected that ahead of time these things were not going to be profitable. So it becomes a very interesting case study as far as why were these things actually developed if they were subject to the public goods free rider problem, and on top of it they weren't even profitable. So given the supposed double whammy involved here, why were these turnpike companies ever even a thing? Really, when you think about it, they shouldn't be a thing if nobody's going to make any money off of them. Well, there were two main reasons why they actually existed and why they were very prominent and common. And those two things were, one, indirect benefits, indirect economic benefits, and number two, community support and social pressure involved. So indirect benefits refers to things like maybe they won't make any direct dividend income off of the private turnpike company through the tolls and so on and so forth, but there were benefits to the people involved. If there was a road connecting two cities, then the people in those two cities would get indirect benefits from the road being there, whether they made any money off of gained any dividends or profits off of owning a share of the turnpike company. They might get indirect benefits, say, in increased land values and increased transportation between the cities, and this would also help to facilitate trade between the companies and transportation of goods to other areas. So if you were a business owner in that area, one of those cities, it would benefit you to do this sort of thing. So that was that's how the indirect benefits came into play. And the social pressure and the community support and social pressure involved had to do with the fact that at this period of time, a lot of these things were handled, a lot of things in general were just handled at the town level in the United States. So a lot of people would know most of the people in the city, and their social standing could be affected by the actions that somebody might take. So for example, if there was say an initiative to have a turnpike company build a road between a given city and another city, whether or not a particular person was a contributor to that turnpike road would affect their social standing within the city. So that played a very big part in whether these sorts of things, whether somebody might actually do it, and was actually a very big incentive for people to do it. And there were two main ways that that the promotion of these things would be handled. One would be individuals would go directly to people in cities and make the case directly. So they might go to particularly prominent or wealthy individuals or leading citizens in the city, in the town, to convince them to go along with it. And the other thing was through newspapers, advertisements in newspapers. And newspapers were very common, and people would read up a lot on local events and things that would affect the local area. So a lot of marketing would be done through the newspapers, and that would create social incentives for people to participate in the turnpike companies and financially support them, even though they might not get any direct benefit through dividends or profits. So those were the two main ways that social pressure would be applied to ensure participation and support of the turnpike companies. So moving on to chapter 5 in the book Voluntary City, we get to entrepreneurial city planning. So here we have a contrast between government city planning and private city planning. And other examples of this are things like condominiums, shopping malls, and trailer parks, and things of that nature. But there's another example that took place in Chicago during the 19th century called, it was Chicago's Central Manufacturing District. And what this was it was a plot of land where people would, that people could develop on, and there would be a central planning board that would step in and provide communal services and goods that were normally provided by the government. So this started as the brainchild of a gentleman named Frederick Prince, and he bought up 250 acres of land, and through a central architectural and engineering firm in this 250 acre plot of land, built up a whole bunch of what would normally be considered public goods, such as roads, sewers, sidewalks, rail lines, and other things that would be useful for various businesses that might want to step in and be a part of this. And that's what he was pretty much developing this area to be. So this was handled through a central organization that oversaw the planning and development of all of this infrastructure within this area, with the hope of bringing in business clients and customers to either buy or rent as tenants for this area. And all of the planning was not done ahead of time. There was always some flexibility was given to changing things in the future. So it wasn't set in stone ahead of time. Some things were, but they tried to make sure that they had some flexibility going forward. Some other benefits of this central architectural and engineering firm handling things was they were able to do these, to engage in the development of these services at lower cost, because they were able to negotiate through, they were able to get more competitive bids, and they were able to buy things in bulk. Now, this was the original 250-acre plot eventually expanded. They were able to also expand into providing other services like power and steam generation, docks, railways, sprinklers, and just a whole bunch of other things that normally you would think would only be handled by the government. But yeah, they were able to expand into those areas, and they continue to expand further into other things. As far as the central planning organization for this district, they actually expanded also into banking and also contracts and things of that nature, which was, I think that's very interesting. The other thing was, because of the friendly financing that they were able to provide to their tenants within the central manufacturing district during the 1930s, which, if you're familiar with American history, that was those were the Great Depression years when many businesses were going under. However, in the central manufacturing district, only one business out of hundreds actually went out of business, and one of the main reasons was the beneficial financing services that they were able to provide to their clients that allowed them to better manage and weather the storm of the Great Depression. So, and again, I mean, when you think about it, they really have an economic incentive to help these businesses not go under, because then they lose clients and they lose money. So they have an incentive to come up with good banking solutions to help these firms survive tough times and help them grow. So this is, again, it just goes back to the economic incentives involved, and how the private sector in this instance was adapting to the market conditions. So there were some other interesting things about the Chicago Central Manufacturing District, one of which was they eventually put out a regular magazine to help build up the community cohesiveness within this area. And the other thing was that the benefits and the services didn't just extend to the businesses themselves. They also extended to the workers through provision of low-cost housing, recreational areas, workers' lounges, and things of that nature, because they want, I mean, the happier the workers are there, then the better off the businesses are, and again, the better off the central architectural and engineering planning board, the better off they are. So all of this just goes back to responses to market forces and providing what it is that people are demanding. And Chicago's Central Manufacturing District persisted until sometime in the mid-60s, when economic reality set in, and a lot of manufacturers started to go out of business, and there were other issues involving the economic climate based on the laws and regulations within Chicago. And eventually it started to shrink. I think it's still around in some form or capacity, but it's much smaller. But again, for many decades it served its purpose in support of the particular economic businesses that were prevalent at that point in time. So nothing lasts forever. Just because a business goes out of business doesn't mean it wasn't a very useful and an example of excellent private provision of a particular service. So here we have another example of private provision of services and other amenities, various infrastructure that normally the government would be the ones providing. And again, here we have another example of private provision of these services and goods and infrastructure. So again, that's the end of what I'm going to cover in this book, chapters 2, 3, 4, and 5. Like I said, this is just a high-level overview of the things that are in those chapters. I strongly recommend that you read the book. There is much more and much very interesting detail in the chapters that you'll definitely want to read. Yeah, so I would say go out and buy the book, and I will continue to read the book. I just finished chapter 5. I'm going to be moving into chapters 6 and 7, where they are talking about private provision of policing and also private legal systems. And my plan is to have the next video cover those two chapters pertaining to those two topics. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one. Have a great day.